So, Susan, ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Gene Tischauer, and I'm the co-chair of the Toronto-Danforth Writing Association Outreach Committee and of Cinema Politica Danforth. So we'd like to welcome you all this evening.
Good evening and welcome to our fourth and final Cinema Politica panel for the year. My name is Gabriella Byron and I'm the other co-chair of the Toronto-Danforth NDP Outreach Committee, which sponsors these Cinema Politica events. We hope one day to be back to our live events, but until we're absolutely sure it's safe, we will continue to come to you virtually in the comfort of your own homes. Tonight, our theme is bringing Canadian democracy into the 21st century. We've had two federal elections since Justin Trudeau promised that in 2015, it would be the last one held under the first past the post system. And both on the federal and provincial level, we're consistently governed by parties that receive less than half the popular vote. Also in small municipalities and large ones like Toronto, our local plans and needs are often thwarted by provincial interference. Our democratic system is out of date. And we're delighted to have an excellent panel here tonight to help us understand how we might be able to fix it.
While we're discussing improving our democracy, it's important to note that the First Nations here on Turtle Island were governing themselves quite effectively for centuries before the colonists arrived. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples, and we respect their right to their own forms of democracy. Before we get started, we'd like to outline the format for the event. Our moderator will introduce each panelist, who will speak for around 10 minutes, followed by a discussion among the panelists and the moderator. And then we will take questions from the audience. You can add your comments or questions in the chat room at the bottom of the screen. Susan McMurray, the magician in the room, will mute your microphones, but we'll get as many questions as we have time for to our panel. And thank you, Susan, for all your hard work on this. Tonight, we're going to be hearing a lot about proportional representation, which can be a little vexing and complicated at first hearing. And we'd like to keep a little cinema in our events. So let's start off with a bit of fun on this subject. Here's a short video from CBC show. This hour has 22 minutes. To whet your appetite.
Canada's electoral system is something called first past the post. It's an antiquated relic we inherited from the British. You know, the people who gave us steam engines, colonialism, and tin can telephones. And like a tin can telephone, it doesn't really work. Here, let me show you. So the Liberals and Conservatives each got a third of the vote, but the Liberals got 39 more seats. Meanwhile, the NDP got 1.7 million more votes than the Bloc, but 9 fewer seats. The Greens got 2% of the vote and only 2 seats, and the PPC got 5% of the vote and 0 seats. I know what you're thinking. How the did this happen? There's got to be a better way. A lot of prominent political commentators like Andrew Coyne believe that the answer is proportional representation. But it can be a little bit difficult to explain to people because it's like a complicated thing.
Actually, Leonard, it's not that hard. It's a system where everyone's votes get represented in Parliament rather than just those who happen to vote with the largest block of voters in each riding.
What other countries have this?
Just about everybody.
Why don't we have this?
Accident of history, inertia, and the fact that the people who got elected under this system don't want to change it.
Huh. Thanks, Andrew. Well, our electoral system is broken, but it sounds like proportional representation would be a great solution. If we had that in the last election, the Liberals and Conservatives would be in a dead tie. We'd have more NDP-style socialism. And with the Greens, the PPC, and the Bloc, we'd have a dash of that climate change, racism, and the French that the rest of us try to pretend doesn't exist. Now that is a government that truly represents Canada. For 22 minutes, I've been Leonard Chan.
So now I'd like to turn the mic over to our esteemed moderator for the evening. We are very pleased to welcome Craig Scott back to Toronto-Danforth. He's well known here in the riding as our NDP Member of Parliament from 2012 to 2015. And during that time, he was the official opposition critic for democratic and parliamentary reform. He is a lawyer specializing in international law and human rights and is currently Associate Dean at Osgoode Law School. Thank you for being our moderator, Craig, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Gene, and thank you, Gabriella, as well as everybody else at Cinema Politica and Toronto-Danforth NDP, both provincial and federal, for organizing, putting together this evening together. A few things have already been said about the purpose of the evening before I introduce the panelists, and I thought I would just add a few comments. The panel organizers note in the circular that while we're proud of our democratic traditions in Canada, our system is seriously outdated and no longer fit for purpose. First past the post elections routinely create false majorities and ignore the democratic will of Ontarians and all Canadians. And as Gabriella noted, the Liberals in the 2015 federal election pretended, I remember this well, that they would get rid of this system. And indeed went a bit further with a little nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and fooled many into thinking this meant they were actually open to proportional representation. Now, when their bluff was called in Parliament after the election, and almost no one supported the particular system that they wanted, that would have ballooned unearned majorities even further, they pulled the plug. Municipalities, another subject for this evening, are subject to the whims of provincial governments, as just confirmed by a narrow 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Toronto versus Ontario case that had been brought by the city against the province for what many of you will remember, it's not so far back, for having changed the ward boundaries and halved the number of councillors for the city council in the middle of the last city council elections. Just one result of provincial absolute monarchy, in effect, over municipalities, apart from the assault on democracy that the Supreme Court majority allowed to stand in their decision, is how provincial ministers' zoning orders ride roughshod over local planning, both in Toronto and potentially every other municipality. So what does it mean for democracy when our system leaves so many of us without a voice? That is the core question that our panel's organizers fundamentally wish us to explore tonight. So it is that our panelists will discuss what democracy means in Canada at this juncture, this far into the 21st century, when democracy is teetering on the edge of more than one abyss in many countries, and where forces, global forces, like climate change, obscene social economic inequalities, and neo-fascism are both threatening and democracy and need effective democratic responses. Issues the panelists will explore together with each other is whether we can afford any longer not to have an electoral system organized around some appropriate version of proportional representation, whether we can afford to have a federal system that gives effectively absolute legislative power to the provinces over municipalities, and whether local urban democracy needs to be reshaped in the face of the economic and political forces that join hands to define and ultimately impose what local development, so-called local development, looks like. The panelists, who I'll introduce in just a sec, will each speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for them to briefly comment on one or two key points just to get things going. One of the others is made as part of a discussion. Before we open to questions from the viewers that will also feed into a kind of a discussion format. So please put your questions into the chat, maybe not so early, but when you have them and you formulate them, I guess, put them in when they're ready. And we'll try to present as many as we can to the panelists, or the panelists will see them too, and they can choose what makes most sense for them to address. And I may make some effort with some assistance to bundle some of them if some of them seem to be asking similar things. So on to our panel. And the first person speaking, who I'll introduce, and then he will speak, and then we'll move on in that fashion. First person is Dennis Pillon, my colleague here at York University. He's currently an associate professor at the university in the Department of Political Science. His research has focused primarily on issues of democratization and democratic reform in Western countries in both contemporary and historical context. In addition to extensive publications, Dennis has done considerable public speaking and media work, commenting on many aspects of politics, particularly on topics relating to elections and political parties. He's also acted as a consultant on election issues for various entities, law firms, political parties, trade unions, community groups, and the Auditor General of Canada. There's a connection, Dennis, I didn't know we have on the panel of senior advisors for the Auditor General. He's currently a member of Fair Vote Canada's advisory board as well. So Dennis, would you like to get us started?
Great. Well, thank you, Scott. And thanks to Toronto-Danforth NDP for asking me to participate in this event on such with an esteemed group of colleagues. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Wow, it's a really good crowd of people. I was told I'd have 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to fall somewhere in between there. I'm going to put my little
stopwatch I say 10, but I get angry 15.
All right, so I'm going to share the screen because I've got a little PowerPoint. I've managed to show up to every referendum in the country somewhere other than the Prince Edward Island ones. I haven't been able to make it to there, but I was able to get out to the 3 BC referendums and the Ontario referendum. And so I was out in the last BC one and sort of doing some public talks on the event. And again, we came up against situations where the things that we were hearing in the media, and particularly, of course, from the opponents, but also sometimes from the public that was a bit confused about the issues, were just not on the mark in terms of any kinds of facts. And so I put together a PowerPoint that sort of said, well, what do facts tell us? Rather than speculating in a vacuum about what a new system might do, what actually has happened in countries that use these systems that we talk about. And so I've sort of repurposed that for tonight, and I'll go through it. If I'm going through it too quickly, don't worry. I'm going to make the slide deck available to the organizers. If you want to have a look at anything from it more closely, it may go by rather quickly in the context of this conversation. So what were the emerging issues? When we start talking about first past the post, our voting system versus PR, there's lots of issues that typically come up in the media discussions, and the various pundits weigh in and they say all kinds of things about, how much parties are represented, or whether diversity is represented, voter turnout, whether we'll have majority government or chaos, whether there'll be cooperation amongst parties, whether there'll be an effective alternation in government, whether government will be unstable, and whether or not the whole system will be too complex for voters to handle. So it was these sorts of questions that I asked myself, what can we find out by looking at countries that use proportional systems to answer these questions, assuming that people are asking in good faith? Well, so here is our first set of answers on the disproportionality. To what extent do systems effectively represent what people say with their votes? And we can see here with this table that, the further you move away from PR, the less proportional the results become, not surprisingly. So in other words, when we look at what kinds of results the different systems produce, it's pretty obvious that first past the post and majority voting systems just don't represent what people say with their votes, whereas fairly consistently proportional systems do. So in that sense, the evidence is very clear. We can see this, I'm looking at the 2017 election in New Zealand, but we could have looked at the most recent one as well. And here you can just see how the mirroring of the popular vote with the parliamentary seats. Look how close the results are here in terms of what people said with their votes, which are kind of like communication device, telling the other people what kinds of representation they want. And then look at what they got in terms of their representation, a fairly close accordance between the two. On questions of diversity, again, the evidence is quite stark when we compare like with likes. So we want to compare countries that are similar in terms of their political development, similar in terms of the strength of their women's movements. And so what we find out when we do that is that countries with proportional voting systems have more women in their legislatures. Now, these figures are from 2018. You can see I've just inserted 2021 for Canada in there, where there's been a striking advance from 27% to 30%. I mean, all right, it's improvement. We should take it. Our voting system is not an absolute barrier to diversity. It's just that it tends to move much more slowly, especially when we consider that in terms of their women's movements, their relationship to left parties, we don't see a significant difference in terms of the kinds of attitudes that Canadians have compared to these other countries. Here's a really interesting and I think exciting result in the New Zealand elections. So you can see here, up until the adoption of the proportional voting system, the representation of the Maori, the Indigenous people in New Zealand, remains static. And with the adoption of proportional voting, they not only meet their proportion of not only does their representation in Parliament now match their proportion in the society at large, but it even exceeds it. And what's interesting is that PR creates a dynamic in New Zealand where parties compete to represent the Maori, which was something that didn't occur before the adoption of PR. So the point is that before, one party, the Labour Party, was the only party that made any effort to represent Maori people. But after the adoption of PR, it created a dynamic where all the parties started to make an effort to represent the Maori. And so very interesting results that obviously are quite relevant for us here. Voter turnout is a vexing question amongst experts of voting system reform. You can see here that, broadly speaking, proportional systems do have a higher voter turnout than first past the post systems. And again, it's because they're more competitive. The competitive aspect of PR means that parties are making more efforts to mobilize a greater group of voters. Whereas, of course, our system tends to leave a lot of voters sitting at the sidelines, many of them with really no representation at all after the election is finished. Now, we should offer a caveat that there has been a decline in voter turnout across all Western countries. So even PR won't necessarily fix all the problems, but there are some distinctions, broad distinctions in terms of turnout between first past the post and PR voting countries. What about the nature of majority government? Here we can see, in looking at results from New Zealand, that the prior to the adoption of first past the post, we see majority governments, but they have a minority of the voting support. After the adoption of mixed member proportional, we see that change, and that governments are much more broadly representative of the party system, and they also tend to represent a much larger group of the electorate. In fact, they get very close to actually representing a majority when they have a legislative majority. And of course, in the most recent election in New Zealand, we see this is the case. What about changes of government? One of the accusations we heard in British Columbia was that changing the voting system would allow certain parties to stay in power forever. They'd always, have an influence. Or, in fact, in the British Columbia example, the claims of the right was that the left would always be in power, the Greens and NDP would rule forever. That's not really the results that we see in countries that are comparable to Canada. When we look at the history of these countries, and here I'm just looking at the MMP using countries, so Germany and New Zealand, we can see that there's a fairly regular alternation in government between the center right and the center left. So there's no reason to think that a change in electoral system will necessarily privilege one group. In fact, with the British Columbia example, the comparison to first past the post is quite striking because one side of the equation has dominated representation in British Columbia ever since the emergence of an electoral left. There's been a right-wing coalition in power pretty much uninterrupted with now three exceptions. What about instability? This is a fairly common claim that if we adopted PR, oh gosh, everything would be crazy, we'd have elections all the time, everything would be unstable. Well, how would we actually look for evidence of that? One way we could look is to look at elections and ask ourselves, if a country is so unstable that they can't form a governing majority or a minority government, then they would have to go back to the electorate. So we would expect to see the number of elections as one test of whether or not the system is unstable. What we discover when we look at countries that use PR is that they don't have any more elections. In fact, in some cases, they have fewer elections than we've had in Canada. So the argument that you need a majority winner-take-all system to have stability is not supported by the evidence in terms of the number of elections. The number of elections are very comparable across these systems. What about instability in terms of the stability of a governing coalition? This is one thing that we hear a lot of, is that, oh gosh, if we went to this system of PR, well, there'd be all this negotiating going on, and one party could have a temper tantrum, hold everybody hostage, So has this been the experience of countries that use PR systems? Well, I'm just looking here at New Zealand to see the number of confidence and supply agreements that they've established. And how many of them have been broken? How many of them have been ended before their term? And in fact, there have been 9. I had to cross out 8, and now there's been 9 with the most recent election. Absolutely none of them have been broken. And those are supply and support agreements between the center right and the center left. So there have been governments of the center right who've managed to create stable coalitions, and there have been governments of the center left who've been able to do the same. Okay. What about complexity? This is one, this has got to be a greatest hit of the claims, is that if we adopted PR, it would just be too confusing to the voters. Poor voters, imagine them out there struggling to try to figure out how to mark their ballots. I mean, gosh, the crocodile tears we hear from the opponents of PR over this issue. Well, one of the ways we can test this is we can look and see to what extent do people make mistakes when they vote. So if we look at the spoiled ballot rate in different countries, that would be a good indicator. If the spoiled ballots are high, that would tell us that maybe it would tell us that the system's too complicated, that people are having difficulty managing it. Or if it's low, then we might expect that the system is not too complicated for people to use. Well, what we can see here in comparing the different countries is that it doesn't appear that people are having any difficulty marking their ballots. In fact, the numbers look comparable to the kinds of results that we see in Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, where all people are asked to do is mark an X. But in countries like Ireland, where people have to number their choices, they don't appear to be having a grave difficulty in making those decisions. Just looking to see how much time I'm taking up here. All right. Well, there you go. I'm done. So there's some a slam of evidence on the kinds of results that we see in PR countries compared to first past the post. And but there may be questions. So please hit me up with whatever you want to talk about. If you want to talk about this, or if you want to talk about other more political questions about how to get PR, I'm happy to take up questions on any of those things.
Great, thank you so much, Dennis. So I think we'll continue to move on, and everybody remember the questions you have. They're starting to appear in the chat. Our next guest is Saman Tabasinejad, who's the project manager at Progress Toronto. She believes that meaningful change can't be achieved unless actions that address and remove systemic barriers are taken, and she's particularly interested in how large policy decisions affect everyday lives. Among her many other activities, Saman currently serves on the board of The Platform. Now, this is an organization working to reshape the political landscape to advance the priorities of young Black, Indigenous, and racialized women and gender diverse youth. And in 2018, Saman took the plunge and ran for office in North York. Her educational background includes degrees both in anthropology and in political science. So Saman, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much, Craig. And thank you all for having me here today. It's great to be spending the evening speaking to everyone about democracy and maybe power, and maybe how we can kind of think about our political systems in advancing our shared interests or progressive interests. So my name is Saman Tabasinejad, and I'm the organizing director at Progress Toronto. So recently had a title change. And for those who are not familiar, Progress Toronto is a not-for-profit organization that organizes and advocates for a more just and democratic and progressive city. And I don't have a slide deck, but hopefully you can kind of follow along. I'm going to be focusing more so on local democracy here in Toronto and local power. So our Progress Toronto, we think a lot about power, who has it, who doesn't, and how we can use the things that we have access to, the people we have access to gain power. And really, sometimes when I think about democracy or what makes a good functioning democracy, it really has to do with the balance of power. If everyday people have the tools they need to shape their lives. So, democracy can look like voting. It could also look like proportional representation. It could look like having access to your representative. And it could also look like a democracy in the workplace. So thinking about how we share power, how we use power, and making sure we have access to power. So thinking about power, Progress Toronto, perhaps similar to folks here, we believe that our power doesn't come from wealth in terms of money. I know that no one at Progress, and neither does our family, sit on any boards of the Toronto Star or Rogers Corporation, which might be in contrast to perhaps our current mayor, Mayor Tory, and we don't have access to millions of dollars to pay for lobbyists. And that's, I don't know, maybe some of you do have access to that, but I'm assuming if you're here today, perhaps you don't think that if you have access to those types of more traditional ways of understanding power, that shouldn't be necessarily the way that we shape our democracy to serve those interests. So, but what we do have access to is community. We have access to people. We have access to our neighbors, our colleagues, our allies. So we really believe in our theory of change at Progress Toronto is that if we organize enough people, we can build power and make a difference and push city council and elected officials to do better. So what does that look like in practice? So we have 4 pillars to help realize this theory of change. The first is building power, which is growth and trainings. Similar to what we're doing here today, we're learning about how we can think about the different ways our democracies can function. Thinking about the different tools, the different possibilities that we have access to, and kind of learning more about that. And we're kind of growing in that, right? So we're building our capacity to enact change. The second pillar is pushing power, which is issue-based campaigns. No matter what, any politician wants to get reelected, and if we push a city councillor on a specific issue, so if we push a city councillor to prioritize housing, and then that city councillor knows, hey, 10,000 people in my riding have taken action and they're telling me to vote progressive on housing. If I don't do that, I know that they're following along, and they'll might vote against me in the next election. So we really think about pushing power in that, so our issue-based campaigns. Checking power, which is holding politicians accountable. For those who aren't super familiar with Toronto City Council, one of the beautiful things is that there are no parties, so a lot of the votes can be quite free. And so no one really, not oftentimes, votes along party lines in the same way as the Ontario legislature or the Parliament. So checking power means that, but because there aren't any parties, a lot of people don't know how their city councillor voted. There could be, you probably have neighbors who don't know who their city councillor is, or what they've done on housing, or what they have done on transit, but they might see a newsletter once in a while, and then they don't know where to place the blame if transit doesn't happen or if housing doesn't happen. So in checking power, what Progress Toronto does is we want to hold those politicians accountable and let constituents know how their city councillors voted. And what makes us kind of unique as an organization, and it's probably why we're all here today talking, is really when checking power and pushing power fail, we work to take power. So we work to unelect really terrible city councillors, like Giorgio Mammoliti, if anyone remembers infamous city councillor that seems to be wanting to run for mayor in Wasaga Beach, unfortunately. But I have faith that in Wasaga Beach, the population will not vote him into office. But we also work to elect amazing candidates. And we really get involved at the election level, because everything that we've built through the issue-based campaigns, to the growth in trainings or in our trainings, and holding politicians accountable, we want to put that into an election to move people to take action, to get them involved at the municipal election level. And it's coming up in October 2022. So this kind of leads us into what democracy means, at least at the municipal level. And to kind of talk about this, especially meaningfully about the city of Toronto and our municipal election system, we really have to think about the 2018 election. Sometimes maybe those of us who are very involved think about this time as not the most joyous moments of our lives, but it is important to talk about, especially in the context of local democracy. So for those who are not familiar, in 2018, City Council was set to, the 2018 election had expanded the City Council. So the City Council had undergone a process to create, I think, 3 new wards and redraw some of the boundaries to make the system more democratic. Had undergone a very serious consultation process with the public, and there were going to be 47 wards. It was really an opportunity to change City Council. And this is for maybe folks who were not super familiar with Progress Toronto's history. This is when Progress Toronto was founded. We were founded in April 2018. And we really saw the opportunity that this new ward system presented for progressives, for people who've been regularly shut out of City Hall. So there were a number of open seats. The wards were there was a huge opportunity to change City Hall. There were a number of progressives running strong campaigns across the city. And there were many racialized young women ready to fight, ready to change City Council, ready to put the needs of their communities at the forefront rather than put the needs of the lobbyists. And actually, I was one of them. Like Craig said, I ran for office. I ran twice in 2018. So I ran provincially in Willowdale, and then I ran municipally in Willowdale because our team was able to secure actually a pretty high vote count provincially. So it was kind of a great opportunity to switch over to the municipal, and it was an open seat. So back in the day when that seat was called Ward 28, and now we only have 25 wards, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So there was really an opportunity for our democracy to be more democratic, our election system to be more democratic, our ward system to be more democratic, and City Council to be more reflective of the diversity of Toronto. But of course, as we know, as history shows us, Ford came into power June 2018. And one of the first things he did, I remember this, it was at the end of July. I had just finished canvassing. I got wind, or we all heard, that Ford slashed City Council. And he slashed it from 47 wards to 25 wards. So what does that mean? That actually was not what he kind of framed it as. It was not this kind of benevolent, oh, who needs more politicians? It was obviously very deliberately a move, a political move to make sure that the City Council stays more conservative, and to kind of squash to make it much more difficult for progressives to win, to make sure there were less open seats. So we went from a 47 ward system to a 25, where a lot of incumbents had there were like 2 incumbents sometimes running the same seat. So it was much more difficult for a new face or a new person to get in. And it was really we were in this situation where a lot of candidates were all of a sudden running against their progressive allies. And then in my case, in Willowdale, the incumbent, John Fillion, actually came out of retirement to run in the ward. So you can imagine it was quite a wild scene, So there was a lot of different people vying for some of the 25 wards and vying for a seat at city council. And it pushed a lot of progressives, and the reality is it pushed a lot of progressives out of the race. So especially women, young women, and a lot of racialized people out of the race, people who didn't have access necessarily traditionally to those kinds of power, and it favored name recognition incumbents. And it also created a lot of confusion among voters. Imagine you're a voter, maybe you're not as closely engaged as you are today, but you're a voter and you hear that there's an election, and all you're hearing in the news is, hey, we're at 47-25, 47-25, and you probably don't even know, like you're at one point you're tuned out. So we did see, I do think that there was actually a lower turnout for 2018 than previous elections, and we also want to say that when /city council, it made city council much as like each city councilor had like less power and the mayor had more power. So it just became a much more mayor strong city council, or however it really favored where the mayor sat, because there was all of a sudden there were less seats, there were less opportunities to push for progressive causes, and it really made it a little bit more difficult. So we kind of know how 2018 unfolded. Unfortunately, we weren't able to. A lot of city councilors that were progressive, some of them didn't even get reelected. So it really favored conservatives on city council. And Progress Toronto, we worked really hard to oppose the cuts to city council during the election, but also after the election. So we took city councilors. We took the province to court. The court first ruled in favor of us, then ruled not in favor of us during the election. So again, a lot of confusion in the mix, making it very difficult for people, the citizens of Toronto, to engage with local democracy. So after 2018, Progress Toronto campaigned to the city, telling the mayor and telling city council to stand up for Toronto's local democracy and take forward to court, to take forward to the Supreme Court. We were able to be successful in that bid, and we were actually granted intervenor status, and we at the Supreme Court of Canada, and we kind of presented at the court earlier. I don't know what the correct terminology is, so maybe Craig, you can correct me later on. But we were the court kind of debated on or judged on this issue earlier this year, and just I think in September, unfortunately, the court did rule against this. In favor of the province, and saying that it was within their right to slash city council. But we argued that the move was undemocratic. And one of the good news is that we only lost by a narrow margin. We were lost by 5-4, to 5-4. So there were 4 justices that did agree with our argument. So hopefully that this gives an opportunity for future local democracies to fight for their rights as to be more than just creatures of the province. And moving forward, what does that mean? What does it mean when we have a democracy that sometimes, especially locally, is really at the whim of the province? What it means is that we have to think about where our power comes from, and maybe sometimes it doesn't always come from the courts, but what it can come from is from the people. So right now, we know what the ward system looks like. We know where our opportunities lie. we have a couple of open seats up for grabs. And we're gonna build on what we built for the past 3 years in making our city more democratic, which is campaigning on issue-based on the issues that resonate with people most, to bring them into the democratic process, and elect allies onto city council. So as we move into this 2022 year, we're looking at the municipal election, but obviously we're looking at the provincial, and hopefully we elect the city, sorry, not the city, but the province of Ontario elects a better government that allows local democracies to decide their own fate. And really what we need to do is think about how we are going to use the few tools maybe at our disposal to enhance our democracy, and sort of put people into place or into power that are accountable to us as the people, and who are invested in bolstering our democracy, not squandering away and concentrating power like we saw in 2018. So I will leave that there because I think I am over time. And I really look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saman. So our next and final speaker before we enter the discussion mode is Dr. Mariana Valverde, who is a professor at the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies at U of T. Since 2006, she's been a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She holds cross appointments with the Department of Geography and Planning and Faculty of Law at U of T. Professor Valverde's main research interests are currently urban law and governance, historically and at present, including a current research project called Planning by Contract, which eliminates how legal tools from private law and the governance structure developed for and by public-private partnerships are changing local municipal governance. Mariana also participated as a witness in the case we've heard about a couple times now that the City of Toronto brought against Ontario when Ontario and the Ford government intervened in the City Council election to reduce the size of council. And apart from, I'd say, leading scholarly publications, I know a lot of Mariana's work. She writes for magazines, newspapers, and online fora as well, mostly on public-private infrastructure partnerships and provincial municipal politics. And she's also a resident of Toronto-Danforth. So Mariana, would you like to take us away again?
Okay, thank you, Craig. I'm going to try and be quite brief because I really think that we need to, especially since the Supreme Court decision that Craig and pretty much everybody else talked about, we need to think in bigger terms. I mean, I'm happy to support proportional representation if there's a referendum or something. I'm happy to support a lot of things, but we do need to think about the big picture, in part because Canadians have long been too complacent in thinking that courts can save us from bad laws. And personally, I don't want to owe my rights to the Supreme Court, whoever they happen to be, or sit around hoping that the Harper appointed justices will be, struck by the finger of God or something. So I think we need to think about the big picture. And the big picture is democracy, as Gabriela said at the beginning. And people often talk about democratic deficits, and we certainly have seen a lot of democratic deficits. And, Saman explained many of them at the local level or the provincial level. There's ministerial zoning orders. We could go on and on documenting a whole bunch of democratic deficits. But in my view, which may be more colored by the fact that I'm an immigrant to Canada from a dictatorship than perhaps I have thought up until this time. But in my view, the talk about democratic deficits here, there kind of avoids the issue, because the real issue is the deficit in public awareness of democratic deficits. I mean, really, after that decision of the Supreme Court, people should have been out on the streets. If this was, you know, any country with a recent history of dictatorship, people would have been out on the streets. But it was presented in the newspapers as, oh, well, those people in Toronto, they always want special status and, you know, blah, blah, and who cares about them, basically. So what is democracy? I think we know that democracy is not just 50% plus one, especially with a first past the post system. And we know how various voting mechanisms can be gerrymandered or otherwise fixed, as you know, Saman explained with the Ford law. And it's interesting because that Ford law did not say that city council would now be appointed by Queen's Park, but it could have. And the Supreme Court, at least 5 justices would have said, that's fine. You can do whatever you like. I mean, you know, some of you might have seen the 2 op-eds I did for the Toronto Star on these issues. And in one of them, I said, well, this, you know, decision is not about Toronto. It's about the fact that Jason Kenney could wake up tomorrow and rename Edmonton Jasonville, and he could appoint all the mayors in all of Alberta. Now that is much more serious, you know, I think. Anyway, so what is democracy? Well, democracy is about fairness, and it's about the people, right? It comes from the word demos, which means people in Greek. So it means the 99%, not the 1%. And it's not 50% plus one, because if it were, Indigenous people would never have gained any rights at all. They are not a majority, and they're not likely to be a majority in the near future, even though they were a majority at one time. And so what is democracy? It's fairness, it's justice towards people, it's being inclusive, it's paying attention to, it's facilitating people's input into things. And so certainly this whole court invented doctrine of municipalities as creatures of the province. I mean, I talked to a whole bunch of people who were quite well educated, and they all said, oh, I thought municipalities as creatures of the province. I thought that was in the BNA Act, that was in the text itself. Well, no, it's not. Some people decided that it said that, but it's a bit like the, you know, Second Amendment in the US. A lot of people think that it means you can carry a gun into a school or a shopping mall. Well, it doesn't actually say that. And so I think we need to say, okay, since we didn't get the Supreme Court to even rap Doug Ford slightly on the knuckles, which I thought is what happened. I thought there would be a sort of slight rapping of the knuckles, and he would be told, oh, you can't interfere with an election in progress, but nothing would be said about anything else. So we wouldn't be much further ahead, but that didn't happen. So what should we do? As I said, I don't think waiting around for the Harper appointed justices to retire is really a very democratic response or realistic. And I mean, I'm not the one to decide what should happen, but I think it's time to consider more radical alternatives. In Chile, where they went through 2 years of incredible turmoil and protests on the street about a whole lot of things, and where they did have a serious think about what it means to come out of a dictatorship into a democracy, they had a constituent assembly. Now, a constituent assembly is not something that you see every day, but it means the people are getting together, and usually it's sort of voting by sector. So students, women, racialized immigrants, tenants, whatever, unions will have, representation. It's not like our current parliament. And a constituent assembly can then decide on a new constitution. And I think it's time to say the BNA Act is not Holy Writ, and we should get rid of it. I mean, it was clearly an instrument of colonialism. And why should we treat it so, respectfully? And the Charter of Rights did some things, but it didn't do a whole lot, especially by not including the right to a fair and free vote in municipal elections in Section 3 of the Charter, which Craig, I'm sure, could talk about in a much more learned way than I can. But a constituent assembly is true democracy. It's democracy in action. It's democracy from the bottom up. And it's not just fiddling with the electoral system, though that might be a good thing to do in the meantime. So I don't know what it would take to get this idea of a constituent assembly out there. I'd like to ask the Progress Toronto people if this has ever crossed their minds. But I think that this is a good time to do that, in part because we have been let down by courts. We don't have much of a remedy, and everybody in Ontario, even many conservatives in the 905 complain that they're living under, King Doug-Ford. So it's time to think about something more radical, and it's time to think about a new constitution in which First Nations and municipalities would be accepted and recognized as the levels of government that they are. Because the BNA Act was just, how do we split up this power that we've inherited from the UK, from the colonial office? How do we split it up between the provinces and the feds? And only the provinces and the feds were in the room. And that's the same thing that has happened with constitutional conferences in more recent years. It was only, men in suits representing the feds or the provinces. Well, that's not democracy. And no wonder people are bored by the idea of constitutional reform, because that's what it has looked like. So a constituent assembly would just be great. Anyway, that's my idea for the day. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, everybody. I think I've been scanning through the questions in the chat room, and I wanted to just pull a few together and then ask the panelists to just engage each other as they would otherwise, or maybe work some of these. But there seems to be a few interesting common currents in the questions. One is, and picking up on different themes from each of your talks, one seems to be a concern with effective representation. The idea of a power-based sense of influence that comes out of whatever form of democracy one is looking at, whether it's council structure or whether it's a proportional voting system, versus just the sort of the sense that you get to vote and your vote counts in an individual popping up in a legislature. Does this also translate into something that you'd think of as effective power in a political sense? And does that have connections that take us beyond representative government, whether they're councillors or whether they're legislatures formed by PR, for example, to something that's a little bit more spread out, participatory, and vibrant? And then the third theme that links in with this is there was a question or two on how to think about all of these proposals, but maybe particularly PR when it comes to ensuring meaningful diversity. And Dennis, you gave numbers on different women and Maori in New Zealand, etc. But more generally, why would we have faith that tinkering with the system is going to produce meaningful diversity? So those seem to be pulling together 5 or 6 of the questions so far, and I would leave it at that, but just to leave you all at liberty to make a few more comments, engage each other, and maybe engage a bit of that. Anybody want to start?
I can start if no one else wants to jump in. Thanks to the other panelists, great comments, and I would agree with both the various caveats you put in terms of the comments I offered. PR is the fight for PR is not the be all and end all unto itself for itself, as Marianne says. It's about what could it possibly do to and for democracy. And here, I think we need to remember that Canada was not founded as a democracy. In 1867, the franchise was limited. Most of what the founders spent their time talking about was the Senate. And they were desperate to make sure that their privileges and their ability to dispense patronage would be protected in this new colonial legislature that was going to unify these colonies together. There's nothing democratic going on, which is also why the courts are a problematic friend, because they often look back and they look at the constitutional architecture, but they forget that that constitutional architecture was structured in a non-democratic setting. Why are we being held to the limits of a system that was never intended to be democratic? Well, the answer is we're not, as Mariana says, struggling to make it different, right? So why PR? I mean, I've put a lot of energy over the past 35 years into the PR question, and it's because PR in the Canadian context would fundamentally alter the basis of executive power. What do the courts say in this recent situation with the Toronto City Council? They basically said, we're deferring to Parliament. Our courts tend to say, for the most part, as much as possible, we're going to defer to Parliament. And while I don't support the government, I think that's not a bad situation, because allowing these appointed, unrepresentative people in the courts to make these decisions, I'm not sure they are the flag wavers of democracy and freedom either. The fact that we get a few decisions we like shouldn't cloud our judgment about the overwhelming role that the courts play in sustaining the status quo. So that's where PR comes in. It's would it alter the competitive dynamic that affects elites, that forces them to make more concessions? And coming back to Craig's point, the fact that PR systems are more porous, that they're more competitive, that they're more open to new political competitors, all those things suggest an opportunity for mobilization. And the ability to try to put pressure in the way that Saman has suggested with the city councillors, increase our points of pressure. One of the biggest barriers we have right now is that a party with 35% of the vote can get 60% of the seats, and as Fair Vote Canada likes to say, 100% of the power. And they can be tone deaf to the things that people want. I love the idea of a citizens' assembly that would look at our constitutional architecture, but we have the same problem with that we have with PR. How do we get the powerful to concede it? And when we look at countries that have been able to get it, it's often because there has been the political class has been discredited in some way. So that kind of brings us back to our situation. How can we exploit moments when the political class is discrediting itself? How can we try to attach our mobilizations to some of these specific demands? Because we can't count on the courts, and frankly, we can't even necessarily count on the parties that say they'll support the issues, as we saw with the Liberals. But also, and I realize I'm in a partisan audience here, but the NDP has not been the strongest champion all the time for this particular issue.
That's absolutely right.
And so that is one of our challenges: is how do we keep the politicos' feet to the fire? How do we try to mobilize the public? Which it's not realistic to expect them to become election experts. These are real problems, real challenges.
Well, Craig, can I just quickly jump in? So I think that those of us who are fighting for democracy in different venues, I've been more involved with the city, and well, not the city itself, because I don't want to say that democracy is only important for big cities, or that somehow people who live in big cities are better citizens or more citizens than people who live in rural townships. I'm really keen on local democracy, like no matter where you live. And if you're in Nunavut, you probably need local democracy more than if you're in downtown Toronto. But, you know, beside that point, I think we need to learn a lot from what Indigenous people have done with small numbers, because in the years that I've lived in Canada, which are many now, I mean, there's been a huge shift in the visibility of Indigenous politics and the sort of credibility of Indigenous leaders and the support by non-Indigenous, you know, people of settler descents of various kinds for Indigenous causes. I mean, you know, maybe I'm sort of clouded by the fact that I spent last week in Vancouver, where, you know, you can't turn around even in middle class or even upper class areas in Vancouver without seeing signs saying, I support Fairy Creek, or I support the Wet'suwet'en. And, you know, that I think is a significant change. And that's been done without political leadership from the top. So, I mean, if that can happen, geez, anything can happen, you know, because there's been such a change. And really, I mean, I think Dennis and I, and, you know, possibly Craig would agree that you can't get anything like a citizens' assembly or a serious look at the Constitution unless there's widespread popular support for it, because you can't push that sort of thing. I mean, even proportional representation, which you would think would be more manageable and sellable, might seem too obscure or too difficult or something. But, you know, we might as well be paying for a sheep for a lamb. So if we're going to go for proportional representation, why not also go for our colonial structure of the BNA Act? You know, really? And I think if municipalities were to ally with First Nations and say, First Nations, municipalities, provinces, and feds are all the 4 levels of government in Canada. Well, that would be something. And I don't know if it's possible, but it's not impossible. I don't know what Saman or other people think.
Yeah, I think that in terms of like an organizing perspective, or how do we achieve a different democracy or a different system, a different democratic system than we're currently, or if we can even call the current system we're living in democratic. From an organizing perspective, I think that there needs to be like a tie to what a good democracy can offer, what it can achieve for people through like a material sense. Like what does it mean in terms of housing, in terms of transit, in terms of childcare, in terms of labor rights, in terms of, you know, distribution of wealth. And I think that's sometimes what's missing in these like PR conversations or democratic conversations, or even what with the slashing of city council, because I think in general, the average person probably heard that Ford was doing something to politicians, and they were probably like, I have more important things to do than think about how many seats are at city council. But what does that really mean on the ground or for their lives? We're not trying to increase, like make our systems more democratic, because for politicians, we're actually doing it because they will yield more equitable, a more equitable society. So I think that it is kind of a comms issue with PR and with maybe a people's assembly, but how do we move away from these kinds of abstract ways of thinking about democracy and more of like the tangible material? What does it mean for people? Because I do think that there is a general distrust in elites, but who are the elites? Like we have to kind of find those terms or organize for those terms. Like I do think that the general population is frustrated with the widening wealth gap. We're seeing that with like what the elites, I guess you could call them are calling it the labor shortage. But really it's a good job shortage. It's people realizing, hey, I don't want to spend my entire life working for peanuts so I can be yelled at work and be put in dangerous situations. It's not worth it for me. So I think that they're like if we tie democracy to those issues, or more democratic institutions to those issues, I think we can get some headway, build some popularity, some grassroots support that is already kind of brewing. Because I do think with Wet'suwet'en and Fairy Creek and people understand, like a lot more people understanding the deep injustices that these colonial systems have on Indigenous peoples, or they're understanding them at like a very basic level, like with the residential school, what I'm going to call them murders. So people are understanding like the injustice that's happening around them. They don't know where to focus their energy on necessarily, or who's an ally and who isn't. I'm sure a lot of different folks are feeling there aren't any allies in terms of political allies in terms of what's happening, what's what. So I think that the average person needs to be kind of guided in that. And I say that for myself as well, because sometimes we're all just tired. Like we want to just finish our jobs and go to sleep and figure out our lives. But there needs to be some sort of like our energy needs to be concentrated or directed at something.
I could add something. All these contributions are circling in a space with a lot of the comments coming in on the chat, where there's some kind of either intellectual, intuitive sense or just a gut feeling that somewhere along the line, however complicated so-called modern democracy is and how hard it is to change, part of what we've discussed, the notion of something bottoms up that takes seriously consensus, that itself has ideas of cooperative problem solving and decision making, seems to underlay a fair number of the questions, whether citizens' assemblies, constituent assemblies, ideas, is still all about something that's more bottoms up, that's participatory at the outset. And then there's a fair number of the questions that are wanting to figure out, well, how does any of this relate to maintaining participatory involvement that produces real results in the sense of shifting power in a way that improves the lives of hopefully everybody, but certainly those who most need it. So there seems to be, and the thing I'd like to offer by way of just an added element to this is, it may not be the time to talk about doing things online. Everybody wants to get offline right now after these last 18 months or so. But there's a fair movement afront on different tech platforms and in a lot of different social experiments in different countries, using different forms of e-democracy as ways to produce sort of depolarized consensus, and to try to get people engaged in the way that gets them seeing where others are coming from. They see enough of the differences that they can accept the final consensus because they're more involved, and then and you can scale this. E-democracy can be just scalable compared to other, it makes the idea of Greek local democracy more possible than the general idea of, well, why don't we run Canada like we do a good city council kind of thing. And so one of my thoughts is that at some point, one of the shifts is going to have to be, how do we use the potential for serious, significant online engagement that produces real insights and also kind of a sense of satisfaction about a consensus that people are part of. And then that interacts with our representative democratic institutions. They always feel under pressure from what is being pushed up through either you can call it bottoms up or you can call it sort of online democracy, in a way that is both participatory and representative at the same time. For one, however many flaws I saw as an MP in being a representative and what representatives can and can't do, it's probably impossible to have a political system that doesn't have an element of representativity. But we're so far over in that direction that we're not harnessing any of the sort of collective wisdom, collective intelligence, and sort of bonding, social bonding that a good participatory democratic process can produce. And I'm not sure how far we're going to go, but my sense is a combination of what works at a lot of local levels and what can possibly work with technological assistance online is got to be part of the solution. So in terms of somebody asked a question that came up after the bottoms-up constituency assembly comment. How would a consensus style of government similar to Nunavut's work in the provinces? Does anybody want to tackle just the idea of, can we, even as Dennis is correct to say, that one of the virtues of a PR system is producing a more competitive framework so that different voices actually emerge. It also works in the federation better. Alberta doesn't just send 38 conservatives, but you actually find out that there are NDPers and Liberals and Greens there too. Quebec doesn't just send 57 NDPers in 2011 just because it wins 42% of the vote, but et cetera, et cetera. You begin to get a less stylized, caricatured view of different parts of the country. So that form of diversity, I think, from a federation's perspective, is really important. The multiplicity of having enough seats to produce diversity in the Toronto City Council example was front row and center. What I heard Saman talking about for a good 3 to 4 minutes, which is, look what happened when 47 went down to 24, exacerbated by how it was done, when it was done, etc. But everything was on track for greater diversity, partly because there was more capability to attend to local communities in the way in which the boundaries have been drawn up in a bigger city. How do we put all this stuff together and still, diversity produces tension, it produces competition, all this kind of stuff. But can we marry that with a politics that feels more productive from an eventual consensus generating perspective too? Are those two impossible things that you do one or the other, you can't do both.
Well, if I can sort of add something slightly to the side, maybe slightly tangential.
You don't have to answer me directly. It's just, yeah, please.
In Dennis's presentation, because he was mainly talking about national political systems and national elections, he didn't talk about the fact that in many countries with proportional representation, people vote for the party that they generally like. They don't have to know anything about the candidates. And I think that's one of the reasons why you get higher participation. And certainly one of the problems with local City of Toronto elections is that the individual candidates have to get known to individual voters. So they'll say, I'm going to build a dog park in your neighborhood, and that gets them a few votes. But those voters might not know that that person is either right wing or left wing, which they always are, but you don't know that. So I think it would be a slight improvement, though I'm not going to be fighting for it because it's not the most important thing, but it would be a slight improvement to no longer have this ban on parties at the municipal level, even if they're parties that are just basically slates, sort of for the purpose, like they have in Vancouver, where they have slates. And so, generally you vote NDP. And of course, in BC, everybody's either left or right. There's hardly any middle. So, people know if they generally vote NDP or they generally vote the opposite. And that way, it puts less emphasis on the individuality and on the door knocking I mean, I shouldn't be criticizing door knocking in Peter Tabans's writing because, of course, he's so good at it. But it shouldn't be personal popularity, and that's something that maybe Progress Toronto could think about. I mean, of course, right now we can't do it because the province won't let us even have a referendum on proportional representation. So we're totally stuck. But if we have a different, provincial government after next election, I would like to see some forum, some sort of local democracy forum somewhere that takes up the issue of why is it that we've had this ban on parties at the municipal level, whereas we think the parties and the be all and everything when it comes to provincial and federal elections? Like, what is the problem here? Because I think municipal elections would be improved if we had parties that had a program and then they were accountable for that program, rather than, what in some of my writing I've called the village elder style of politics at the municipal level. So that's sort of another additional point, and it's not, as I said, it's not going to be my issue that I'm going to be fighting for, but something to be considered. Dennis, I don't know if you have any views on this. Obviously, you know a lot about this, but as I said, the absence of parties is so bizarre.
Yes, you're right. And I mean, my former colleague at York, Bob McDermott, did a lot of research on municipal funding for political purposes. And what he discovered was that, barring Toronto, which did have some public funding, basically developers run the show in most municipalities. I mean, we see the hypocrisy of the political right. They play up this romantic notion of the local member who's there to listen to the grievances of the people, and then they turn around and they cut the level of representation and make it nearly impossible for anybody to do a functional job of representing people. So it's a convenient political argument that they make. The reality is politics is about collective action. And a party like the NDP should understand better than the others that collective action is what gets the job done. So when we hear talk about the lack of parties, or wouldn't it be great if there weren't parties, people are kind of getting sucked into a kind of apolitical understanding of politics that certainly doesn't advance progressive politics. Where we see a lack of parties, we see a lack of political diversity, we see a lack of gender and ethnic diversity, we see a lack of specifically ideological diversity. So there are good reasons why, having some sort of collective representation at city council would be a dramatic step forward, whether, as you say, it's slates or a connection with the parties. The reason why we often see a lack of parties in places like Nunavut and Northwest Territories and municipalities, barring the major ones, is because these jurisdictions are wholly dependent on the next level of government. And what that means is that the political representatives cannot be outside of the executive governing structures, or they're putting themselves literally outside of the economy. That's why you don't see parties fighting it out in Nunavut or Northwest Territories, because everyone there has to be a friend of whoever is in power with the person at the next level. It's also why municipalities, you see, the councillors don't want to identify publicly with parties, because they've got to be everybody's friend when they go cap in hand to the province to fund whatever they need, because we know that all the problems of contemporary society are dumped on the municipalities, but none of the funding is there for them to deal with it. So they have to go begging to the provinces and the feds. So no, I hear what people are saying. I get the frustration that people feel, particularly with parties and the way parties operate. But the best way to solve that, I think, by looking at what's happened in other places, is to improve the competitive dynamics so that people can hold parties accountable. That's really the issue. The issue is not that parties are bad. It's that people feel that they're stuck with them. If you don't like X party on the right, too bad. That's the only one you get to vote for. But imagine a system where voters could make those parties more accountable. That, I think, would be a more productive step for voters than encouraging them to adopt, nonpartisan approaches, which frankly just feed into a very strong right-wing body of theory that sort of suggests that the problems of municipalities are just administrative. We don't need politics there. We just need good administrators who can help the economy work well. Well, that's a pretty old right-wing trope. I don't think we want to go down that path.
I would like to kind of push back on this a little bit, just because I follow student city council very closely, and I think one of the great things about it, perhaps this is kind of a Canadian problem. If you elect one MPP or one MP from, you know, the NDP or the Liberals, they're like never going to vote against their party line, and there is a lot of there is no culture about voting against the party in Canada. There might be that kind of the culture in the US. You know, there's like lots of different factions of the Democratic Party, of the Republican Party, but that's not the case here in Canada. So I would say, like, I'm not necessarily, at Progress Strong, we don't have a position on parties, but personally, I don't think that the parties would solve the issues at City Hall. I think that I'm a firm believer of actually door knocking. I do think that if we want a more engaged democratic system, regardless of parties or not parties, then people need to feel like they know who's representing them, what they care about, and there definitely needs to be an accountability process that's built in. And the issue is that no one knows, even with, like, I think if you speak to the average person or like the average voter in Canada, they would say something along the lines of, okay, Liberals are voting or are doing enough on climate change. Trudeau is doing enough on climate change. Trudeau is a climate champion. So I don't know if, like, the party system, if really necessarily would solve those problems. Of course, internally, there's a lot of issues with a lot of parties in terms of how democratic sometimes they are. But I do think that if we're thinking about a more democratic municipal government, especially here in Toronto, we do need to kind of tie politicians to the motions and the decisions that they make. And I do think that you're right, that there is an issue where people don't know how, you know, for instance, Stephen Holiday, who's notoriously conservative, if anyone watches City Council, you are probably you probably know what I'm talking about. But I do think that currently in the city level, there are paths to victory for progressives, for the left, because there's not a party system, because we can push city councilors to do certain things on, for instance, housing, and sometimes on in transit, or because especially if they're really popular issues. If everyone was a party system, I do think that especially the makeup of Toronto City Council right now would lean even more to the right. And
yeah,
there
but
are
it wouldn't be, you know, the same councillors who are sitting there. They're there because they do the Rob Ford thing and go to somebody's front yard to mediate their neighbor's fight with them or something. I mean, Rob Ford got elected because he was doing the city councilor thing constantly, every day, all the time. And so people knew him and he solved their personal problems. But
yeah, of course, but
you know, that's not a good advertisement for the village elder sort of style of politics. Like in a village, that might be one thing, but in a city like Toronto, I mean, people are not going to know their city councilor, even when you had 30,000 people instead of 100,000. You still couldn't know them. And so people, you know, councillors curried favor with the BIAs and with the ratepayers associations. And that's who counted, and that's who shows up to vote. So, you know.
Yeah, of course. And so I don't know if going to a partisan system would increase vote totals. I do think some people think they know Justin Trudeau. I think people voted for Justin Trudeau because they feel like they have a connection with him through his dad, through the family. I don't necessarily think that I definitely hear you. I do think that, like, the reason though that someone like Rob Ford could win, but someone like Trump, someone like Doug Ford, is because they're seeing the failures of the state and exploiting them. That's what they're doing. Oh yes, so you have an issue, your housing is falling apart, I will fix that. You have a giant pothole in the front of your house, I will fix that. And that's, I think the answer to those questions is more like is obviously a policy one, but these kinds of village elders is what you're saying, or what you're referring to, or maybe more of personal clout can only flourish when you're seeing a complete, like not a complete collapse of the state, but a somewhat collapse of the social of the state and the social safety net, and completely an abandonment of government from individual people. So I hear you that I do think though, if we're moving to a municipal party system, and there needs to be like coalition, maybe like a progressive caucus or something like that, that people are voting together. Also, like you want to make sure that city councilors are voting in a block. You know, sometimes you have one vote and a city councilor might vote well on that, but then the next vote, which is probably very similar, they get extra pressure from the mayor and then they end up switching their vote. So there are those issues. But then on the flip side, you have like previous city councilor like Jim Carey-Giannis, who was quite conservative on a lot of different things, but he did vote against like the privatization of garbage or the garbage collection and some labor things. So not to say like because it works for us in one context, it shouldn't work for the other. I don't know at this current juncture of city council if the party system would enhance the situation before we fix like all these other problems. And I don't know if it should map on directly with the provincial, the federal governments, like the federal parties. That's just my 2 cents.
I think we've stirred up quite a number of currents for future discussion. I'm conscious of the fact that we were to end around 9, and a number of people do have to leave, including guests. I just put my parting prediction is that one way or the other, we're going to find within 1, 2, 5, 10 years that we can't talk about democratic reform or the health of democracy without talking simultaneously about how do we both save what we have as democracy and improve democracy in the face of climate change and all of the attendant forces it's unleashing. Everything from neo-fascist populism to right-wing climate change embracing non-denialistic forms of right-wing politics that are now using climate change as a way to build new democratic populist bases under our noses, as a way to produce pressures to create Fortress Canada, Fortress Europe against migration, etc. The biggest thing we're all going to be facing, interacting with every other problem you can think of, from economic inequality to racism, is climate change and the forces it's unleashing. So if I ever get out from under an administrator's desk again, I honestly think that the idea of climate democracy, what the hell can and does that look like in various contexts, is to me almost the biggest question we can ask, because we're going to be asking 2 big questions at the same time. So I put in a Guardian link to all of you that should scare the Jesus out of you, I was going to say, and I just said it, from yesterday, that gives you a really developed investigative journalist's sense of how the combination of information systems in the internet world and climate change and right-wing populism is now congealing into a new mass in ways that really just doesn't give us the luxury of thinking about ideal democracy as opposed to much better democracy to solve a huge problem and to prevent what we have now from being completely stomped under. So, Gabriella, can I pass it back to you?
Yes, just a quick wrap up here. On behalf of Cinema Politica, thank you very much, Craig, Mariana, Saman, and Dennis, for taking time out of your busy lives to share with us. It's been a very interesting and provocative evening. We really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who have joined us tonight. Just want to remind you that there is a film we posted. It's from the National Film Board and it's called What is Democracy? I posted a link in the chat room But if you haven't caught that, it's easy to find on the NFB website and it's free to stream. And for that, after that, I'd just like to wish you all happy holidays, and we hope to see you all in the new year's. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And Wilf Day, I am glad to see what's happening in South Africa, because the ANC that I worked with 30 years ago has screwed things up so badly.
Yeah.